30th, and we are interviewing this evening founding pastor of Bower Hill Community Church, Bill Barker. For transcription purposes, the interviewer asking the questions will be Jim Burke, and accompanied by campaign chairman Dave Hicks.
In Hilton Head, and I've got 2 of my kids married and 1 in college.
Oh my goodness, can't believe it.
No.
Boy, you make me feel old.
They make me feel old.
I'll bet they do.
Well, you sound great.
Oh, great.
Just kidding you.
If that's something you want to do, then...
Oh, well, as I say,
And I do believe we are a go. Okay, Bill, just right off the top, little thoughts on why did Bower Hill come into being, and we'd love to hear what was the situation back in 1950.
1950. Seems like just neons ago. I was finishing seminary, and at that particular time, I was serving as a student assistant at the East Liberty Presbyterian Church. East Liberty Presbyterian Church, and what was at that time the Mount Lebanon Presbyterian Church, that's now the Southminster Presbyterian Church, were to be the kind of co-sponsors, the daddies, of a new church development out on Bower Hill Road. At that particular time, the houses were going up, streets were being put through, and it was one of the biggest growth areas anywhere in Allegheny County, and the need was obvious for a new congregation to be located in that area. I was the fortunate one to be picked to go out and start this new congregation from scratch. Had one member, that was, of course, Gene, and Presbytery had hauled up from Camp Shelby, Mississippi, an old Army hospital unit, which was framed there again on the property of right at the corner of Parkview Drive and Bower Hill Road. The little hospital unit, which has kind of picked up the name, the Little White Church, had a small steeple put on. There was no insulation, no storm windows. About a third of the thing was excavated underneath for a partial basement. It was on a severe slope. And I went out in the first part of July of 1950, assigned to organize a congregation. That particular time, the only way to go about it was to conduct a very aggressive calling program, so had a doorbell campaign, went from house to house, street by street, up and down, everything from Cochrane Road clear on down through what was then called, maybe still is, Bower Hill Manor down in Scott Township. And for the following 8 weeks during July and August, morning, noon, and night, I was pretty much there on the streets using a lot of shoe leather and pushing my first knuckle on down into the second knuckle, I guess, on my index finger. Wanted to be able to start the congregation having worship services with an opening service in September, about the time that school was opening in 1950. And I also very much wanted to make sure we would have standing room only by the time we opened the doors then, and then to be following up with regular morning worship services and a Sunday church school for the young families that were coming in. We had no facilities there in the sense of chairs, pews, pulpit, or anything, so had to spend a great deal of time, of course, and energy trying to scrounge whatever we could and cast off furniture from other congregations, defunct churches, wherever we could find any kind of furniture and appointments just to have the place where somebody could sit and we'd be able to start our worship services. Had an old beat-up upright piano to start with, and then later on a pump organ. And we did have our first services of September of 1950. I suppose I had several kind of private goals. One was people, another was program, and program meant key lay involvement, making sure we were getting good, strong leaders, persons that came in right away we began to work with and making sure they understood what we were about. Planning also to see if we could not get a unique personality of this new congregation. There was an excitement both in the gospel of Christ and also a sense of participating in something new and unique in a new community congregation. We deliberately decided to name it the Bower Hill Community Church Presbyterian, with the emphasis upon being a community of Christ's people and, of course, proud of our denominational heritage as Presbyterians, but not accentuating that to the exclusion of welcoming anybody who felt called as a Christian to follow Christ. The services took off. We immediately began to plan programs, namely, first of all, a Sunday morning regular worship service that had meaning to it. Found somebody that could play the piano and then the organ later on. Started a Sunday morning church school. Most of the people who were uniting with the congregation were young families, and also an adult education program. I was quite concerned that we have new member classes right away, which we started, and insisted that the persons planning to, at least considering uniting with the church, would participate in these classes so they would know what we were trying to be and who we were trying to be as Christ's people. Likewise, emphasizing the fact that we were responsible for reaching out in the local community. From the very start, Bower Hill, the fledgling congregation, was deeply involved in the ecumenical life of the community, working with other congregations, and also with the interfaith community. We were instrumental in helping the neighboring Jewish congregation to be able to have a place to meet. They met in our congregation's home for a time, and then we were also helpful in seeing to it there were no restrictions put on their attempt to put their own facility down further on Bower Hill Road, Temple Emmanuel. Likewise, service to the needy, and this was from the very beginning a key part of the Bower Hill program. One of the first things we did was to reach out to the Native American community. I had a contact out in the Native American Indian Reservation at Tuba City, Arizona, and we started a program there of sending aid, clothing, and money to assist in whatever ways we could then. And the next real concern, of course, was property. I mentioned the fact there were no pews or chairs, pulpit, or any kind of furnishings like that. We also were in what was obviously a very temporary building. To begin with, there was a special variance by the Mount Lebanon authorities allowing that particular building to be put up on the corner of Parkview Drive and Bower Hill Road. It did not meet the specifications at all, and they allowed it to stand with I forget what the time limit was, but just for a few years, so we knew we had to find more permanent home for the congregation rather rapidly. We were also aware, and I was particularly aware of the fact that Presbytery made it very clear that we were to repay what were called grant mortgages. That would be repaying the Presbytery for the cost of that little white structure, the former hospital unit, which had been hauled up from Camp Shelby, and also to repay the Presbytery for the cost of the lot on Bower Hill Road at Parkview Drive. So we had some serious challenges from the very start. We had to be able to address, and we did. We also were aware rather quickly that the site that the church was originally on, there at the corner of Parkview Drive and Bower Hill Road, was unsuitable for a church building. There was a severe slope at that particular time, very shortly behind the building that was standing at that time, the little white church. And B, it was a rather dangerous location traffic-wise. We were right on the brow of the hill on a rather sharp curve there on Bower Hill Road. It was just 2-lane at that time, but obviously with all the building going on, it was going to be widened eventually, and access and egress on that location was not really very desirable at all, rather difficult from a safety standpoint. So you're fortunate to be able to get the property owned up on Moffett Street at that time by the Claddy brothers, whom we got to know. And after many conversations with old George Claddy, and I'd had his brother's funeral sometime before, and George was amenable to selling the little miniature golf course that he had up at that location to the church for, I believe it was a consideration for about $13,000, which of course seemed astronomical to us at that time. We managed to secure that, and along with this, we were doing a lot of planning. I'm kind of putting this maybe in sort of an alliterative fashion: people, programs, property, and planning. These key lay leaders and a very involved group of laypersons were much aware of the fact that we had to have long-range consideration taken into mind, and we conducted demographic studies. We were expecting to grow and expecting the community, of course, to grow, and we were planning ahead from the very, very beginning. We quickly learned that we were going to have an enormous bulge of children coming on. It was a rather prolific population increase in that area at that time, and we needed to prepare to meet those needs. From the very start, there was a concern for the future. We had, I suppose you'd call it 5- and 10-year plans to try to meet those goals, and in 1953, even before that time, we were already making plans for building. We were also able to expand to Jefferson School, where we rented space for our Sunday school, our Sunday church school. We went to double sessions, not only for worship services very quickly, but also for Sunday morning worship services, or for Sunday morning church school. And this meant, of course, a deep involvement of a great many people, teaching, singing, serving in various capacities. So this is a little of the way that of the past, what was going on back in 1950 and in the early 1950s. And while in some ways it seems like it's back in the Paleolithic age, at the same time it's very fresh in my memory, and I think just as exciting a time as we've ever lived in our lives, and I'm sure for the lives of many others too.
Well, that's a wonderful opening. You've touched on about 3 or 4 facts that I know I certainly was not aware of, had any knowledge of. So it's going to be quite surprising, the miniature golf aspect especially. From day one, you've mentioned the mission to Native Americans. Can you speak about what your dream was, or dreams, or maybe dream's not the right word, but please phrase it any way you will, for, let's call it, outreach that seems to have been something that's a very rich part of our heritage, so I suspect that it started with you.
Yes, this has been something that's been part of the ethos of the Bower Hill Church, part of the kind of the personality of the congregation from the very start. And there's been a vision on the part of the leaders from the very start that the Christian faith is something more than just a very personal thing, which of course it is, but has to be radiated within the congregation itself, where we're a caring family, and we often use the phrase a family of believers in Christ. And likewise, if we're really serious about our faith, this means reaching out to the wider community, both in the Pittsburgh area, Allegheny County, but also throughout the nation and throughout the world. This has been a strong emphasis from the start, and we've been pioneers in many ways at Bower Hill in trying to carry that kind of a vision into reality. As you're probably aware, we were instrumental in, I think I did touch on the fact that we actually attended the meeting of the Mount Lebanon Township Commissioners to try to intercede on behalf of the Jewish community to be able to build. There were frankly, some anti-Semitic talk going around and some rather poorly veiled attempts to prevent the Jewish congregation from building a building down on Bower Hill Road. And Bower Hill was instrumental in changing the climate and also changing the vote so that that particular congregation did maintain its place to worship or start a place to worship, rather, build a building down there. Likewise, as you're well aware, when some of the changes in the social climate of the world and in our nation were coming along, especially during the early 1960s with the rising awareness that the black community was wanting justice in our country, Bower Hill was at the forefront for that. We were instrumental, as you're probably well aware, in instituting a membership exchange program with inner-city churches that belonged to the Presbytery and welcomed members who were from their congregations who happened to be black, and also allowing and encouraging members from our congregation, the Bower Hill Church, to unite with those churches. This was a great step forward, caused some controversy in the community, and it was a way whereby we all grew, but we recognized we were carrying on our responsibilities of being Christ's people. These are just examples. Again, we were ones that sent work camps up to all over the country, including a group of young men that worked up in Alaska. We were instrumental also in bringing in visitors from outside, missionaries. In 1963, Gene and I took a group of, I believe it was 14 or 15 young people, mostly college-age students, down to Puerto Rico, and where we worked down there in the most poverty-stricken area of the island for most of the summer. In 1965, the congregation encouraged Gene and me to represent the congregation in working in Thailand for the summer, and made this a way whereby we had a deep personal involvement with the community of Christians in that country. I was encouraged with the backing of a session, which incidentally came up and sat on the in the chancel in 1965 to participate in the march from Selma to Montgomery as a way of demonstrating our not just Barker going off in some little personal crusade, but the fact that we as a congregation were deeply concerned that all persons have the right to register to vote, regardless of the color of their skin or ethnic origin or anything else. And as you well are probably aware, there was quite a lot of turmoil going on in the nation at that time that was trying to prevent any registration taking place in certain areas, especially Lowndes County down in Alabama at that time. These are a few of the ways, and they just happen to come to mind. There are others also, I'm sure, that some of the old-timers that are around can remember, but the sense of being a congregation deeply committed to reaching out in the local community and in the world community has been very much part of the tradition and the corporate personality of the Bower Hill Community Church.
Bill, a little closer to home, we've all heard about how the youth program, the education program, grew very dramatically, and you've alluded to the fact that we acquired some space, the use of some space at Jefferson Junior High. Can you tell us what it was like in the building of that Christian education program?
First of all, a deeply committed group of leaders, the lay people themselves, who were aware of the fact that the future of the church, of course, is our kids, our young people, and that kind of deep commitment on the part of these folks, Sunday school teachers, coaches. We did anything we could to let our young people know that they belong to Christ's community. They were welcomed, they were part of it, and needed and wanted. And this took a variety of expressions, such things as, of course, scouting programs, participation in various church athletic programs, softball, there was a church basketball league. We began, after we got the fellowship hall built, to have a special program, especially for boys, which came to be called the Celtics, not named after the Boston basketball team, but named after the fact our Celtic or Celtic heritage as Presbyterians. And this entailed Bible study, worship, sports, and some coaching that went on. The fellowship hall there for a number of years just was rocking several nights a week with these kind of things going on for our young people. The fact, too, we took seriously involving our kids, ushering. As I mentioned earlier, there was one group sent up to Alaska to work with one of our missionaries in the Presbyterian Church, whose name was Bert Bingle, who put them to work. So these young people, starting at the very earliest of age on up through college age, and Dave Hicks, you were one that kind of grew up at that particular time, and look how involved you are at this time.
Well, I'll tell you, Bill, I can remember the Celtic program as if it was yesterday.
Well, these kinds of things were what we were up to, and your dad and your mom were so much part of that, too. That's why I keep thanking the good Lord for Dee and Betty and many, many others like them.
Well, thanks.
I have to ask you, how did you come specifically yourself to Pittsburgh, and on top of that, become involved with Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood? Because that's one of my very earliest recollections with very young children in the 60s.
Well, first of I was born in Pittsburgh. My father and mother were both from Pittsburgh. My father, as you may or may not know, was a Presbyterian minister whose congregations were just across the border in eastern Ohio. First of all, little country churches back of Steubenville, and then later in Canton, Ohio. We were back in Pittsburgh, and then when I finished college in 1947, I won a fellowship, a Rotary International Fellowship, one of the fortunate ones in the world at that time, which took me over to Scotland, studied there, took part of my theological training there, returned and completed my seminary training in Pittsburgh at what was then the Western Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. My association with Fred Rogers, began fairly early on, about that time, in the very early 1950s. Gene's father, whose name was Jarvis Cotton, was at that time the vice president and one of the professors over at Old Western Theological Seminary, and had preached many times out of Latrobe. Latrobe happens to be Fred Rogers' hometown, as you're probably aware. Fred at that time, in the late 40s, was finishing up high school and going on into college, and intended to go on to seminary and become a minister. And Dr. Cotton, Jarvis Cotton, my father-in-law, was a mentor and advisor for him. Fred finished up college in 1951, I believe it was, and decided at that time, when he saw the first television programs coming on, how appallingly poorly done they were and how really so unhelpful they were for kids. Pie-in-the-face kind of slapstick stuff, and not really very helpful or constructive at all, and resolved to do something to try to appeal to young children, which is a deep concern of his then, and of course still is. He went over to New York and spent a couple of years there learning the craft of TV, worked on such programs as Old Kate Smith Hour, the Firestone Music Hour, and many of the other old ones, which are of course now defunct. And then came back to Pittsburgh, and he was I believe the first employee of old WQED, which was the first national public television station in the country, as you're probably aware. It's out there on Fifth Avenue at that time, as well as now. And Fred, in 1953, began a live program with Josie Carey called, I believe it was called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood then. About that time, Fred and I became good friends, and at that time also, Dr. Cotton was talking with him. Fred still had some concern about the ministry. He is a very deeply committed Christian, very active church person, by the way, and suggested that he went to Pittsburgh Seminary and take some courses. This was something he did, and he began, and I got to know him about that time. It took him about 10 years to get through seminary. He'd take Greek, Hebrew, church history, theology, the whole 9 yards of the required courses, taking a brown bag for lunch oftentimes and going out between his schedule on television. And finally did finish up. I think it was in 1958, he and I went over to the Middle East on a long trek together, and of course became just the warmest of friends. He's my closest personal friend, and we've had a lot of fun over the years. I would appear sporadically on his program, kind of as a guest, usually playing my bagpipes, as you probably are aware. Mm-hmm. Testify. Part of my misspent youth over there in Scotland, among other things, was learning how to play the pipes. And then in 1968, Fred asked me if I'd come on regularly on the program by introducing two new puppet characters that he was wanting to put on the program, namely Dr. Bill Platypus and also Elsie Jean Platypus. So I've continued to do the voices and the puppet work, the handwork for these two personalities on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and the Neighborhood of Make-Believe ever since that time. I must testify that Fred Rogers is the same off-camera as he is on-camera. A very gentle, caring, authentic human being with a deep compassion and concern for children and for families, and everything you see there is for real. And I treasure the association, and he's taught me so much in life that I just can't begin to describe how much it's meant to me personally.
He was just interviewed here the other evening And it was only then that I happened to learn that he was the second employee of WQED.
That's right. I think there was a cleaning woman or
Right.
a janitor there just before him. He was the second. That's right.
What really surprised me, though, was that he had been in New York and participated in working on some major broadcasts.
Oh, yes. This is where he learned the nuts and bolts of acting, writing, scripting, even such minor things as, positioning lights and mics and just the craft of producing a television program. And he was started off with the kind of the lowest on the totem pole of the Gopher tribe, and worked his way on up where he became, I think, was assistant floor manager or director on some of these rather well-known programs back in the early 50s.
Bill, back to growing Bower Hill Church. As you evolved through the 50s and into the 60s, that had to be a very evolutionary time, as we all know, in society. From the challenges that faced you day one, were there any that came up as you moved along through your ministry at Bower Hill? What shifted that caused you possibly to shift?
Probably the biggest were number one, the race revolution going on during the 50s. I'm grateful for such persons as Jim Robinson over at the Bidwell Street Church, and Harold Tolliver, who's now, of course, gone. He was out at the Grace Memorial Church. Colleagues in the ministry who were caring enough to be very frank with me what was going on in the black community in Pittsburgh as well as in the nation. And the intensity of the black community. We had lived, as you know, Mount Lebanon and Scott Township are, at least at that time, were a rather comfortable middle class, upper middle class. I think they were all white ghettos at that time, and really little awareness of what was going on in the wider world. Just to digress for a moment, I recall one incident where there was a person who was from India who wanted to buy a home in Mount Lebanon. He was with the Mobay Chemical Company at that particular time, and there were strong neighbors, opposition. I think there were some petitions being passed and so on to try to prevent him from moving in. And Bower Hill even took a stand at that time that went public, saying, "Look, anybody that is welcome as long as they're going to be a good neighbor, but we cannot discriminate on the basis of the skin color or a person's national origin." So getting back to the question at hand, the race revolution was probably the first that came along that nobody, I think, was expecting at first. And the need that I felt I had to assume leadership and meeting at that time was to help our congregation to recognize this was not just something in Pittsburgh or not just a minor blip on the kind of the social horizon, but a deeply felt concern that we had to address, and that there were injustices rampant in our society that had to be remedied. Probably the next one then was all the turmoil that was going on in the late 60s and into the 70s, the peace movement, which grew more severe, especially as we got more deeply involved in the Vietnam disaster. We had especially young people from our congregation who were away at college at that time, who were deeply aware of the fact that what was going on in Washington in both the Nixon and the Johnson administrations were full of deceit, and there was an effort on the part of some to try to change the climate, to withdraw us from the war, at least to call attention to what was happening. There was strong feelings at that time, and then when one of our congregation, a young man, was winged at Kent State, young Jim Russell. This was about the time I was leaving, but it was, again, quite a shock and an eye-opener, as it was for all of us. This was a terribly difficult time to be living through. I don't know whether either of you men remember those days with the kind of intensity I remember them, but they were not pleasant to be living through in many ways.
No, very, very, very dramatically remember them.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Well,
Those would be the two I'd think of right offhand, Jim.
okay. Excuse me. While all this was going on, the structure as we know it today was constructed. And I think one of the things that I wonder about today, and maybe Sessions have wondered about, we have this tremendous heritage for mission. And every once in a while, we, as we are faced with today, have to step back and say, we feel the need to take care of the bricks and mortar.
Yeah.
How did you maintain a balance and a perspective on bricks and mortar versus mission, or what exactly did you communicate as to the relationship of the two?
Well, it was not an either-or. It was a both-and kind of a situation that we had to address ourselves to. The fact we had to have facilities in order to carry out our ministry to our children and to each other. We couldn't just sit on the curbstones and have Sunday school class in the 50-degree, in minus 5-degree temperatures in the wintertime. We had to have roof over our heads and have a place to be able to worship, teach, learn, and serve kind of a headquarters, so to speak. And at the same time, to mobilize ourselves to reach out beyond the walls of the pretty colonial red brick structures to be in ministry for Christ's sake. So there was no pat answer. We just had to keep reminding ourselves that, important though it was to have the building, that was not the be-all or the end-all of why we were there. We had to carefully remind ourselves almost weekly that we were not a religious club that was getting a nice, cozy, comfy headquarters to hunker down in, but rather this was simply a tool whereby we would have facilities to serve better.
Looking back 50 years, you happen to have mentioned that the vast majority of folks forming the congregation were young families.
Yes.
Could you ever have foreseen the day where the majority of members were over the age of 55?
I would not at that time, I guess, because I was so young myself, and in 1950, the bulk of the people moving into those new homes, and Eddie Ryan was putting up row after row of pretty little boxes down there down in Scott Township and in some of the side streets going off Bower Hill Road. Most of them were young vets with fairly recently married, starting their families, and probably the meeting, I think back of early deacons meetings and some of the groups gathering, some of the young married couples groups where probably the median age would be somewhere in the late 20s or early 30s even, although there was a scattering of some older people, some gray hairs as well. But the community at large was a fairly young community at that time, Jim. Frankly, we just had no way of looking in any kind of crystal ball. We all knew, of course, that we would be aging and that the mortality rate's still 100%, and that we would be passing from the scene and there'd be others coming along, but hadn't really considered too much the graying of the population that's, I'm sure, around there as it is in many communities today. And this is something that, of course, is typical of all of the mainline denominations in Protestantism, where the age is no longer the young marriage. It's very, very much, as you say, in the 60s.
Let's talk, if we might, a little bit about the future. And I'd like you to feel free to draw on experiences not just while you were at Bower Hill, but throughout your ministry, in giving us a bit of your perspective, if you would feel free to do so. So, as I mentioned, looking back, what would you have liked to have foreseen? What surprised you?
Well, probably this may sound kind of pious, but just continually surprised by the grace of God, the delight in life every day, and the joy of associating with fellow Christians, with people that were there in Bower Hill and elsewhere all through the years, in trying to be responsible, caring persons has been probably the most delightful thing, and the continuous surprise there are such people around. If you're looking for surprises, external surprises, or I'm not quite sure of the nature of your question beyond that, but that would be the main thing I'd answer to your question by saying.
Okay. Well, one of the phenomena we hear a great deal about today is that, with television, with soccer, with gymnastics, with this, that, and the other things, that the church seems to have taken a back seat in the lives of many families. Do you have any thoughts on looking at what we might do, what any church might do, to put itself back in the front burner?
There are no quick fixes, Jim. What it is people like you and Bev, Dave and his family, and the rest of your family too, and others, and we may be a fairly small and what the world may consider a rather insignificant minority, but we're still the leaven, as Jesus called us, or the salt of the earth. We're the ones to keep the society from rotting. We're the one group that's still committed to Christ, which brings hope in the midst of all the despair and the horrid news that's around. So we don't worry too much about playing the numbers game or looking for the snappy little 1, 2, 3 recipes that are going to somewhere put us on top. We live in a different generation than from what I was around in 1950. It was the Eisenhower era. I used to laugh occasionally. I think it probably could have planted any kind of a church out there, and at that time it was kind of the in thing to bring your family on up and get the kids in Sunday school, and kind of the old traditional routine of Norman Rockwell America to go to church on Sunday and bring the children to Sunday school, that sort of thing. Today it's so much different, and there's no sense trying to pretend that we can somehow step into the time machine and recover what we were going through in 1950s. My point is that when we're faithful to Christ and committed to one another as his people, we'll find ways whereby we're going to not only keep alive the hope that God brings us as his people, but ways of reaching out in ministry that are effective, and they're going to be not only effective but instrumental in bringing changes in the society and in the world. So in spite of the kind of bit of pessimism that some seem to feel in church, I, for one, am a person with hope by seeing, well, even just talking with you guys here tonight, that brings great hope, I would think, not only to Bower Hill, but to the wider community of faith everywhere. Because here you are sacrificing a Monday night, talking with an old man up here in Cape Cod, deeply committed to the work of Bower Hill Church, and that in itself is, I think, indicative of the fact that God's bringing new beginnings.
One of my questions along these lines, if we could walk down through them, looking at how you saw Bower Hill from your perspective going on beyond what you started, what roles do you see churches, what should they play today, theologically, educationally, politically, or socially? Is there anything that you would like to impart to us today, having been our founder?
Well, we continue always as that community of faith to be the spokespersons as a corporate body for the God who, as I say, brings new beginnings, brings hope, and does not just look allowing us to wallow in the past, but to look to tomorrow, the God who instills tomorrows for our lives. We're the one group that can be doing that. Second, we're the group also that are kind of the conscience of the community. No other group has that kind of mandate that we have to be being aware of the fact that those who are suffering, those who are hungry, homeless, hurting in any way, need to have somebody that's going to be a spokesperson or at least an advocate for their concerns. We will always be that, regardless of whether there are only 2 or 3 or half a dozen or 300 or 400 of us in the community. Nonetheless, that's still our task. We've been called, if you want to use that old biblical term, called out to be little bit different and marching to a different sound of a different drum than the rest of the community. And when we're doing that, that means also we're going to be empowered. I'm convinced that God hasn't given up on us, and he will strengthen us to be doing what we're called to do whenever we turn to him and recognize that we have a calling like that. If the need happens to be providing everything from food to hungry there in the community, we'll be able to mobilize others, and we're going to be empowered to do that. God's not dead, as I say.
Well, one of the things that I'm always amazed is when I have participated in a group struggling with something, and it's been an issue that we already settled, agreed on, and moved on. And I think specifically to one topic that we haven't really touched on tonight, and that is women in ministry. We ordain elders, we ordain ministers, and yet how did that evolve? Because all of a sudden, I'm always shocked when somebody's struggling with it, and it's natural to us.
Well, Bower Hill Church, to its everlasting credit, was apparently blessed with a vision way back when we recognized that women, under no circumstances, were to be regarded as second-class Christians or just daddy's little helpers, but to be respected as ones given gifts to be used as the same as any male. We were, as you're probably aware, the first to receive and ordain and receive on our staff a woman as a staff member, as a minister, Gail Buckwalter King. This caused some consternation, I think, probably in the wider community and probably in the community itself, but Bower Hill Church welcomed her, and she did a very effective job during her tenure at Bower Hill. Likewise, almost from the beginning, we had women elders and other people that were, other boards rather, and committees where women were not only accepted but welcomed as ones that have equal status and also should be accorded the dignity. We unwittingly and unconsciously perhaps, but I certainly was aware of it, needed to have role models for our daughters growing up where they would recognize that voices up there in the front or on boards and so forth needed not to be male voices only, but we needed to use whatever kind of gifts that women were given as much as we use those of males. So Bower Hills had that kind of a tradition from the very start.
The other thing that strikes me, and I do not know how it evolved, is we've always felt the need to have young people, teenagers, involved in ministerial search committees. They might be early in their development, but we've always tried to be inclusionary.
Oh, this is just where one of the terms we used a great deal, at least during the time I was there for those years, was we often refer to ourselves as a family of believers in Christ. And family means, of course, different genders, different ages, different backgrounds, different interests, different concerns, but celebrating the diversity there, and that means welcoming and celebrating the gift of young people and as well as women, and trying to include them as full dues-paying, card-carrying members of the congregation as much as anybody else. This, frankly, approached also from a theological standpoint. Both you were mentioning women as the biblical standard. I know there's some, the Southern Baptists and the Roman Catholics and others will not respect women at the altar or won't allow them to be ordained and so forth, but we'd had not only kind of an understanding just the gifts of the women in our congregation, but looking at the New Testament scriptures that women were they were used as leaders, and there is no distinction between male or female in Christ's eyes as far as leadership in the church is concerned. Same way with kids.
Bill, if I may interject this, one of the things that I remember about your ministry, among the many things, was the active role that the lay people played in the church. Could you touch on that a bit?
Well, just began the very beginning. My understanding of the church is that the lay people of the church, I had one guy, I think it was at Bower Hill, laughingly used to say, and he taught me, I think, a kind of a lesson on that in some ways. He said, we really have the church if we shot all the ministers and burned down all the buildings, and the lay people would really take over. It was a way of saying that the lay people are the church, and the leadership, the gifts that are there, are to be respected. And I, again, from a biblical and a theological standpoint, made very clear that we all are the church. There's no hierarchy of lay versus clergy. In fact, the word in Greek is for laos means simply the people of God. That includes ones that may turn their collars around the wrong way or put on a black robe on Sunday morning, and those that don't. The laity means everybody, including Barker or any other minister. Likewise, the word clergy comes from the Greek word kleros, simply meaning the word for called, and we're all called. So this distinction of lay versus minister, sort of an upstairs, downstairs idea of the church, that those that have gone on to seminary and have a couple of degrees behind their names are more holy or more important or something or other, just does not wash. And I tried to inculcate that from the very beginning, the day we opened the doors, and I hope and pray it's stuck, because that's just crucial. We cannot be some kind of a hierarchical group or a group of clergy types who are trying to run the show.
Well, it stuck with me. Thanks.
Well, that's important. I'm glad it has, Dave. Good for you.
One or two more questions, just a matter of perspective on the early days. Can you walk down through what were some of the early organizations or activity groups for the various age groups that had names? You mentioned the Celtics.
The Celtics was a youth program, not just the traditional one for Sunday evening for the kind of nice, clean-cut kids that might want to come out that were going to play church, but that was that. There was another one in the very beginning for young couples. Picked up the name Beavers, Beavers, same as the little animal.
We were part of that.
Were you?
Oh, yeah.
Well, good heavens, Jim. Well, you remember that. Okay, it got started as just Barker's Beavers and abbreviated to the Beavers. And that was one. And then there was another that group kind of grew out of that same. Before we're too old to have fun or something like that. Anyhow, they named themselves the B4s. B, the initial B, hyphen the letter 4, and that group went on for a while. Probably both of these have long since.
Well, when I joined the church, they were the absolutely ancient ones. They were over 35.
They were the old gray-haired ones. Is that so? Well, that was around at that time for a while, and then we had a men's group that flourished for a while. I remember your dad being very much involved in that, Dave. There was a women's association, likewise. Oh, dear, I'm trying to think of some of the other groups that were going on in the very, very early days. But the place was jumping, lots and lots going on, and strawberry festivals. And we started a Thanksgiving breakfast program for the boys and the men. I can recall your dad again, Dee, coming out. You were there too, Jim, where we come in early morning Thanksgiving while the women, I guess, were at home preparing the turkeys, and had a breakfast and a speaker that was there. These kind of things were just some of the things I can recall right off the top of my head.
Oftentimes that speaker was an athletic or a sports figure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it was always catered by...
John Bradley or Mrs. Bradley coming up from Sewickley.
Right. And it was wonderful. I remember that time very fondly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the other things I wanted to ask you, I'm not sure you would want to be 30-something again. I don't want to answer that question myself. But if you were 30-something again, and you seem to still have the energy and the vitality, at least in your voice, and you were considering starting a church, what would you do today? What, any message in particular, or tactics, or I think even today, how would you deliver it?
I don't know how to begin to answer that, but first of all, would try to do some listening of where this particular congregation was going to be located, and who the dreamers were. That thought this might be a reality, and do a lot of praying with them, and go out and roll up my sleeves and do whatever would have to be done. I guess that's what I did back in 1950, and can't replicate precisely what was done then, obviously, but I would certainly, with great zest, continue to work for God as long as I have any kind of breath, and I am and will, and if I were offered that kind of an opportunity, which at 30, I'd be happy to respond to the call if that was something that was going on.
I guess another way of asking the question, having worked with virtually all of your successors, you mentioned the word laity and what have you. I've become of the opinion that the laymen need to minister to the clergy as much as the clergy needs to minister to the lay people. What challenges do you think face ministers today that are different, that we as laymen should be sensitive to? I don't know, maybe that's reaching, but that's a kind of a question.
No, that's a fair one. There's been, frankly, as you well know, there have been some, and at Bower Hill, there's been some not as happy little minor chapters in the life of the church, and you know them, and I know them too. You know them better than I do, where there have been some family discord on occasion, and some times where there was, frankly, some problems, emotional problems or personal problems on the part of the pastor, and we have to remember the humanness of any pastor that may be called. If the man or woman who's called as the minister does not recognize the fact that he is a human being with all of the fears, temptations, foibles, flaws, and we all are flawed people. I know I am, and it's one of the things the lay people at Bower Hill helped me to know, where that kind of recognition of myself was a gift that persons like yourselves and the ones that have been there as lay leaders helped me to realize and helped me to grow with that. And the ministry is, to the minister, if you want to put it that way, by the laity, is not just being yes men or yes women, and at the same time not being just look like they're constantly opposing or be critical, but standing with them as colleagues. We all are part of ministry. It's Christ's ministry, and it's given to us as a community. The person that's called as the pastor is, well, to use the old words, the minister of the word and sacrament, that is set apart for some particular jobs that simply are functions within the community of believers. This does not make that guy or woman who is the minister any better, any holier, any more superior in any way whatsoever, but recognizing that this is a flawed and at times fallible and somewhat at times frail individual who we're going to stand with. I know these sound like kind of pious generalities, but there's no pat answer on it, Jim. That means, in my opinion, the minister would cultivate a group within the session and these boards, and where he could be honest enough of where he or she's coming from, and they likewise with him. Many of the churches now have some kind of a special committee, a pastoral parish relations committee, something of that nature, where a small group can meet regularly with the person who's called to head the staff and be a supportive, friendly kind of counsel with that person to ease the rough spots that may be coming along. And the newer breed coming out of seminary are a little different from what, when I was coming through seminary right after World War II. And many of them, frankly, have not had a deep church background. Many of them come in with some different expectations, although, as you're probably aware, seminary now, first of all, has half female enrollees in all of the seminaries, and the median age in Pittsburgh Seminary is, and most of the other seminaries, is late 30s. I think it's 39 or so, most of the seminaries in Pittsburgh, at least it is. So in more cases than one now, this is a situation where the ministers that are going to be considered would be a little more stable and a little more mature in the fact they've had some experience out there in the big wide world. They're not going to be just some greenie that's right out of college, bounced through seminary, and now coming out a bit naive and not as mature in knowing what the real world's really like.
Well, this has certainly been a wonderful time to share together.
Well, I've enjoyed meeting with you two guys. It's like just a breath of fresh air to hear both of your voices after all these years, and and you've certainly stirred up the dust there in my old brain and rehearsing some of the things of the past, and also making me ponder a little bit the who, why, what, and so forth of not only my own life but ministry again. So I'm very much indebted to you both.
Well, I think what we're about, this is a Celebration 50 fund drive that we're going to be trying to kick off, which from the mere sound of it, the celebration aspect, I think we must celebrate our past and our God-given energies, and then commit to another 50.
Oh, yeah. We're not going to sit back and rest on our oars. We celebrate the past, but also celebrate the future that God's opening up.
And I think one of the things we're trying to do is to give a perspective. When we get frustrated, others were, and
sure were.
overcame, and move onward.
Well, you're going to do that, I'm sure. And I only wish I could be around for the next 50, all of those, and join you in the 100 coming up.
Well, you're going to join us in February, right?
I'm looking forward to it. Gene and I we're counting off the days. It's going to be great.
Yeah, well, we're looking forward to
And
it.
thank Wendy again. She's just been a dear for Wendy Mazzini on
Oh, yeah.
how many emails and letters I've had from her. So she's
And she's a relatively new member, too.
well, she's a one-woman army, I'll tell you.
Yeah, she's very good.
marvelous.
Well, we're looking forward to it.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Dave. Good to talk with both of you, and please remember me, Jim, to Bev, and your kids, Erica, and Sean, and Clint, I guess it is, isn't it?
Right.
Yep, and all your tribe, too, Dave. I can't get over. They're that far along now.
Oh, yeah.
College and out of college, oh, boy.
Yep,
Sobers you up in a hurry.
that's for sure.
Love to all of you, and big hugs to everybody you run into from Bower Hill.
Well, I think we'll say a prayer here Sunday morning for the blessings of this evening, and for, I know, a sense of renewal and energy having had this conversation.
Well,
Again, I want to thank you very
You have
much.
our prayers here. Gene and I remember you constantly, so we're with you.
Okay.
All righty. God bless you both and all your loved ones.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank
Likewise.
you, too.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.